CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy. This is Series 1 of Conversations with Women in African Philanthropy, a CAPSI program known as Adɔyɛ. The series was recorded at the sidelines of a retreat that took place at the WITS Rural Facility in Limpopo in January 2025, hosted by CAPSI's Adɔyɛ program and Nawi AfriFem Collective. Adɔyɛ is dedicated to celebrating and amplifying the contributions of African women in philanthropy while creating spaces for dialogue, learning, and collaboration. Adɔyɛ operates under the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, aligning its mission with broader goals of promoting effective philanthropic practices in Africa. Through its efforts, Adɔyɛ seeks to build knowledge, foster dialogue, cultivate partnerships, and advocate for policies that support women in philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Beijing Moyo. I'm really excited to be joined today by Leila Hessini. Leila was born in Algeria, educated in the US, in Morocco, and in other parts of the world. Leila, welcome to the Conversations.
Thank you so much, Becky. I'm thrilled to be here. It's always an honor to speak with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, and I'm really thrilled I've met you in person. We've spoken over several projects, one of which is obviously the Adɔyɛ project that CAPSI has put together, and thank you for serving on the steering committee.
My pleasure.
But also for facilitating conversations whenever you have the opportunity. I'm aware that there was a conversation in December at the AWID conference.
Yes.
But also when we were in Victoria Falls, there was also another conversation in Morocco. I think there's also another conversation that took place. So thank you for that. But maybe let's start there and talk about your work as a transnational feminist leader. That's how I read as part of your bio, and that stands out. What does that mean, and how has it expressed itself over the lifespan that you have lived so far?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I think, as you mentioned, I was born in Algeria, raised in the US, and then I went back to live in Morocco and Egypt after college. And I actually moved to Cairo in 1993 to join the Ford Foundation. And I was working on the International Conference on Population and Development, and so a global meeting that required a transnational movement and organizing of the feminist movement. And it was in Africa, it was in Cairo. And so it was a very important convening because it was a landmark conference where the UN process, they had started to allow NGO forums in 1992 that paralleled the official UN conference. And so there was a real shift in what was discussed at the UN meetings, because it wasn't just diplomats and bureaucrats and governments having conversations, but it was actually bringing in civil society organizations, feminist groups, researchers, and individuals who had lived experience of the issues being discussed. And so in Cairo at the International Conference on Population and Development, feminist and women's rights organizations from across the continent came, as well as others from different regions of the world. And they really pushed the global community to move from a population control and family planning agenda to one that was grounded in reproductive health and reproductive rights. And so it recognized that people just don't have needs around abortion or contraception, but that they have needs across their life cycles. They have needs both across their reproductive lives and their sexual lives, that health was much more encompassing than just living and being able to live without disease, but it was about living a life grounded in mental, physical, spiritual, and psychological well-being. And so there were all these shifts in terminology and approaches at the UN, but it required a transnational movement. And so that's how I started my life. And then I went to Beijing with a group of feminists. Kumba was there, even though I didn't know Kumba. BC was there. There was a whole group from Africa. I went with a delegation of 13 feminists from North Africa and the Middle East. And so we were going to that conference. It was during Algeria's civil war. So we were coming with perspectives around fighting fundamentalisms, violence against women, and redefining it in terms of structural violence as well as intimate violence. We were bringing women's role in decolonial movements and in independence processes. We were bringing women's memories and writing to this global conference. And so I started as a transnational feminist. I always still think that our world problems are transnational and global, and that requires a connected and strong transnational movement. I also consider myself very, very grounded, and my soul and heart is in Algeria and on the African continent. And that's why I've dedicated so much of my life in living in Morocco, Egypt, and working, as you said, over the last couple of years, really around Pan-African and feminist philanthropies.
And this year marks a very important year, I think, for feminist struggles and movements, given that it's 30 years since Beijing. What has changed, and what are the new things to look out for? I know different groups are organizing to commemorate that, but also to reflect on what has happened since then. So as one of the leaders, what are the things that you could maybe pick and say, this has changed, these are the strides, and maybe these strides that have been made since then?
Well, you know, Becky, I think what's sometimes both heartbreaking but also encouraging, you hold both of those at once. One is that there's a lot that hasn't changed in terms of we move forward on women's rights issues, and there's advances made in abortion access and contraception access and sexual and reproductive health and rights, and in fighting violence against women and structural harms to women. And at the same time, we're in a moment in the world where there are so many authoritarian regimes. There's a genocide happening in Palestine. There's conflicts happening. So I think the struggle is real, and we're always struggling. It's interesting because VC and Kumba and I are going to have a conversation today on actually our perspectives on Beijing. So I hope I can come back and answer that question again. Great. But what's important is that there are real shifts in what has happened. So I would say if you look at funding and Pan-African and feminist funding, women's funds on the African continent, AWDF, the African Women's Development Fund, and Urgent Action Fund Africa were funded in 2000, 2001, so they came shortly after the Beijing conference. And we realized in Beijing, one of the challenges was we came out of a document with 12 priority areas around gender equality. So everything from education to reproductive health to political participation to climate to institutions supporting gender equality, but we didn't come up with a budget and a financing plan for actually financing the Beijing program of action. And so funding has always been an issue. If you don't have dedicated funding to addressing structural inequality and gender inequality, then the programmatic work just doesn't get done. And so I do think that the fact that there are feminist funds across the continent, there are at least 8 that I know of that are part of the Prospera International Network of women's funds. There are community foundations, the Kenyan Community Foundation, both in East Africa and West Africa. In South Africa, there's different funds and community foundations. There are religious foundations that support a variety of issues. Your research also showed that during COVID, people were giving more money. So I think that's something that's very exciting. But I think that, you know, in Beijing, we spoke about structural adjustment. We spoke about capitalism and neoliberalism and how we need to have different economic models that ultimately, if we don't look at the economy, we can't look at the way that money and capital flows. I think there's been more research around that and more feminist analysis of our economic landscape, but I think that's still one of the key challenges. So I'll stop there, but
Yeah.
we can come
So,
back.
and of course, I mean, you mentioned that, early on you worked for the Ford Foundation, which is one of the biggest philanthropies, or maybe even progressive, especially among the international ones. Of course, over time, there's been mushrooming of other forms of mega philanthropies. But, the Ford Foundation has always been focused on social justice issues.
Yes.
And so when you talk about some of the movements, including the feminist and women's movements, there's always been some support that has come from the Ford Foundation. But I want to ask you maybe your reflections on, the interface between philanthropy broadly and feminism, especially in the last 30 years since since Beijing. Of course, I want us at some point to speak about the Ubuntu Harambe initiative. But before we get there, as somebody who started and worked in the philanthropic space, a grant-making organization, progressive, social justice oriented, and then later on involved in all these parts of of experiences and work, what would be your reflections on the interface between philanthropy and feminism?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's interesting. When I started at Ford, women's organizing wasn't around being structured as an NGO or a CSO. And many women's organizations were not taking Ford Foundation money because they didn't trust it. And this was in 1993.
Yeah.
And so there was a whole process of working with Ford to look at how they funded women's groups, how they funded feminist agendas in ways that were aligned with women's values and women's agendas, and funding in ways that allow feminists to pursue their own agendas and not to have a funder's agenda imposed on them. And so I think Ford, at the time, there was a debate that we see again, Becky. So when you say what has changed and what hasn't, we were discussing, do you have a separate program for women's rights, or do you integrate gender across everything you do? We had these conversations in 1994 and 1995, and they resurface again, which is interesting. And so I think that's one part of just understanding where we're coming from and what the history has been is so important to the struggles that we have today, because we already see even at these meetings that some of the work we were doing pre-internet, that some of the research I've done I can hardly even find, but that we need more of the documentation, the research that Adɔyɛ is doing to document and to make sure that we haven't lost some of the history that's so important. I think good social justice feminist funders are key to the success of feminist movements. Feminist movements need resourcing. This isn't about doing free labor. It is about people who are doing the work being funded to do the work. And so I think we need funding that is flexible, that is long-term, that is core. And that's part of what social justice funding is, right? That it's not just how much money you're giving, but that it is that you fund in ways that help leaders and organizations to do the work, so that it's not projectized money, but it's actually movement money. And it's money that's led to funding an agenda that comes from feminists and the movements that we work with and the constituencies we work with. And so I think Ford has really evolved in that way in terms of doing more participatory funding, doing more core, multi-year core support. I think Ford staff also recognize their role as ambassadors and connectors and linkers. So it's not just moving money, but that you have power within your institution to work with others within that institution, but also to work with others in the philanthropic sector. So like Ford is part of Gender Collab, which is a group of funders that work on feminist issues. I think there's 15 of them, primarily based in the States, but now including more European funders like Fondation Chanel. So that's an important space where Ford can use its power. Ford also, all the offices on the African continent are led by women now. That's really important. And when I was in the Cairo office, we did a lot of pooled funding. So we would say Cairo will support this, Nigeria will support this. There was an office in Nigeria at the time, as you know, that covered West Africa, South Africa, East Africa, so that they're also looking continent-wide. What is the role of Ford Foundation that funds in Africa to support movements in ways that go beyond individual countries, individual organizations. But we want Pan-African funding, right? We want the whole continent to be funded, and Pan-Africa as a politic to be funded. And so I think there's still a lot more that can be done there in terms of Ford and other philanthropic institutions funding us in ways that are really linked to our liberation and the way we work.
And maybe that's a good segue to talk about the state of women and feminist funds in the continent. I think over the last couple of years, we've seen, you mentioned AWDF, Agent Action Fund, Femnet, and others, and more recently the Black Feminist Fund and many others. Maybe you are one of the best people to speak about the rise and the evolution of these funds and the initiatives, and how each in their respective mandates are all contributing towards advancing some of these rights. And you have more than 25 years of advisory work that you have given to spaces around human rights, around philanthropy, feminism, etc. So maybe we can spend a bit of time to talk about the state of feminist and women's funds.
Sure. So first of all, just so that everyone's clear, like, what is a women's fund? Because funds are set up primarily to move money. So most funds think of themselves as institutions that spend more than 51% of their revenue moving money. So it's not just doing your own programmatic work, but actually your raison d'etre is to move money. So you do grant making. And so most women's funds and feminist funds think about grant making in a feminist way. So they give money in terms of core multi-year trust-based support. They provide accompaniment. So it's not just funding and moving money, but actually providing support in terms of capacity strengthening, support on organizational development. Sometimes there's committees that have been created around, like, creating reserves, like when Mackenzie Scott gave her money. So they're always thinking about what else organizations need to grow themselves if they so choose, and some group organizations don't want to, but to be as independent, as autonomous, and constituency-led as possible. Women's funds take money from different resources, and sometimes women's funds desire to give money in unrestricted ways, but they're often taking money that is restricted. And so you're always thinking about how you do this alchemy of moving money that may be restricted in ways that are unrestricted and in ways that really serve your constituencies. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the association, the African Women's Development Fund and Urgent Action Fund Africa were both created as some of the first regional funds in 2000, and they work at a regional level. Again, money often comes in dedicated to English-speaking countries on the continent. And we know that there's a lot of money that goes to Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, Zambia, Nigeria, and there's a couple, South Africa, of course. And so if you're, as a women's fund, really wanting to work regionally, then you want to get money to Lusophone and Francophone Africa, to the Sahel, to North Africa, to the Western Sahara. And so you have to do that in really creative ways. Urgent Action Fund Africa was set up as an emergency crisis response. So they give money, and one of their goals is to get money out between 24 and 72 hours to support queer activists, feminist activists, crisis activists, climate activists, in situations of crisis. And again, that's defined from a feminist perspective. So crisis can be, you experience crises because of the identities you have as a queer activist, because of government crackdown in Uganda or Ghana on LGBTQI people, when there have been climate disasters like the earthquakes in Morocco, women's funds came in to support. So they do a lot of immediate response as well as supporting core multi-year grant making to support more systemic issues. Some funds have existed on a national level, like the Tanzanian Women's Fund, and the Congolese Feminist Fund. So they work deeply at the national level in those countries. There's also ISTAO and UHAI that are LGBTQI-led funds and serving funds, and they're both, ISTAO is really focusing on West Africa, including Francophone and English-speaking West Africa, and UHAI works primarily in East Africa, but also in some other countries. There was a fund in South Africa, the Wheat Fund, I think. I'm not sure what's happened to that. There's the Daria Feminist Fund that was created in Lebanon to work across North Africa and MENA. And we're always challenged, right, by how Africa has been cut up and carved up by the colonial powers, but also by UN systems and processes that put North Africa and Middle East under ESCWA and the rest of the country under Africa. So we're always fighting the harms of how we've been divided as a continent, across language, across politics, across just getting to see each other. And I think that's been a real goal of the feminist funds, is to fight that. The other big role that feminist funds have is advocacy in the philanthropic sector. And so they've worked with, like, the Dutch government when we had the MDG fund, right? The Millennium Development Goal funds, and then the SDG funds. They were advocating for funds coming to women's funds instead of going to INGOs. Because initially, like the MDG fund that was run by the Dutch government, all that money was going to go to the CARES, the Oxfams, the Action Aids, and women's funds said, no, we actually have the capacity to move these monies and to manage the money in ways that will support the due diligence that governments have. And that's been something that's been really important, to develop that capacity as funds so that they can then get money to smaller groups, to groups that may not be registered in countries because they can't be, because they do political work, or they're organized as loosely fund alliances or networks that still do really important work, but aren't set up in the ways that, you know, where governments can control them sometimes as well. And so I think that's been a really important role of feminist funds. And then the African-based funds are also part of Prospera, which is this international network. So you have the advantage of doing South-to-South exchanges, like AWDF has worked with groups that work in Haiti, for example, and with Afro-descendant communities in Brazil. And I think that's really a rich experience, to work more in the global South, global majority spaces.
And I think maybe another trend or feature that I think is worth talking about most of the women in feminist funds, is that on the one hand, they've paid attention to inclusiveness, participatory nature, but also issues of diversity. So you see it mostly in how they are structured, in how they are governed, the committees that they've established. So that's one, I think, you know.
That's a really good point.
An area that I think would be useful to address, especially as more and more initiatives might come up down the line. I think the second is also the sensitivity around paying attention to immediate needs, but also thinking about the long term. So most of these funds, as far as I know, the majority of them are structured in such ways that there's a portion that is dedicated to the now, and therefore, you know, you deal with the problems as they emerge, short-term grants and project-based. But there's also, attention to longevity. And so maybe those two, I know I would want us to talk more later about the endowment fund that you are part of. But maybe let's talk about those two. Is this something that you are also seeing, or is it just me and my books?
No, it's not just you and your books, and I love that. No, I think that it is about diversity, and it is about inclusivity, and ensuring that funds are led by the constituencies they serve, and ensuring that you understand where the gaps are in your understanding of the constituencies you serve, because we all have gaps. And unless we're talking to people and doing surveys and getting information, you won't actually know what the diversity of the needs and realities are. Women's funds have been very intentional around gender diversity. So ensuring that they are working with women, trans, and gender nonconforming communities. I think there's also a lot on economic diversity in terms of ensuring that people who have the least access to socioeconomic wealth are included in the work that they do. There's a real focus on adolescents and girls. There's actually an African Girls Fund that Purity in Kenya is setting up very specifically to work with girls and young women, because they often aren't included in some of the funding that gets allocated because it goes to adult women. Yeah. So that's a population that's really underserved. Groups that are just hidden, that we don't even see and know because they're peri-urban or they're rural or they're marginalized communities. I mean, ensuring that your processes and practices reach other people. So it's not just having an open call, but it's actually ensuring that you work in different languages, that your reporting requirements allow for diversity. Some women's funds just allow individuals to send like a video of the report instead of having a report that is a narrative report. So I think there's a lot there. And then who women's funds hire, they try to hire as much as possible individuals who come from diverse movements and who come from the movements that women's funds serve, because they do proximate funding. It's not like Mackenzie Scott gave really great funding, but she's very, very far removed from the people who get the funding she gives. And that's fine. She's somebody with wealth. She lives in another world. She gives in really great, flexible ways and writes checks, but it's not proximate funding, right? It's not knowing the communities and movements you work with and making sure that we also are always really aware of our blind spots, because we all have them, and unless we're really intentional about them, I think that gets left out. And then your second point was around, we always have to make sure that we're addressing the very real practical needs of communities, because people are hungry, people don't have housing, people don't have transportation, girls aren't going to school, girls are getting married early. You know, that's all very real. But then also looking at what are the structural reasons for that. So there's the structural longer term work. And then also, what is the vision that we have for a different world? We don't always want to be reacting to this harmful bill, this harmful legislation, this need, but how do we carve out time and space, Becky? And I think Adɔyɛ is part of that, of creating and envisioning the world that we know we want, the world that will be different, the world that also exists, you know, in different initiatives that are coming up around us. But having time to do both the practical, the strategic, and the visionary, to me is really important. And that's one of the visions that is around how time and money is allocated by feminist funds and movements. It's very hard to do, because that's not the kind of funding you get, right? And that's why having independent resources is so important, to do both, you know, the practical, the strategic, and the visionary, because we get caught very much sometimes in the practical, sometimes in the strategic. The visionary often is like an afterthought, and we don't really have time for that.
So more than 2 years ago, you are brought into this discussion by Trust Africa and the Age and Action Fund to establish what was initially called the Pan-Africanist Feminist Philanthropies, and is now been renamed Ubuntu Harambee Philanthropies. Maybe let's talk about the genesis of that. What led to that conceptualization, and then, you know, in this evolution to where we are today, and if possible, if we can touch on the different pillars. I know there are about 4 or so pillars of the initiative.
So July 22, I announced in May 22 that I was leaving the Global Fund for Women because I wanted to take some time off And immediately Ndana invited me to this meeting in July 2022 in Naivasha, which brought together around 30, 35 individuals from funds, activists, researchers, philanthropists. And the idea was, how do we think about Pan-African and feminist philanthropies in a way that was broad and inclusive? And what did we need to do to move this forward? And the idea, as you know, came from two key regional Pan-African institutions that both do grant making as well as other programmatic work, Trust Africa and Urgent Action Fund Africa. And I think they were created at around the same time, right?
Yeah.
2000s.
Yeah. So
when was Trust Africa?
So Trust Africa is around 2007.
Yeah, you'll know. You'll know better than I will. 2007,
yeah.
And Urgent Action Fund, so 2000, 2001. So thinking of the rich history that these two institutions brought, and then what it would mean to combine and create a partnership around that, and then to bring others into that partnership. And we debated a lot if we were Pan-African feminist philanthropies or Pan-African and feminist. And the reason that it's Pan-African and feminist is because our analysis was that Pan-African movements have sometimes not been as feminist in ways and gendered in ways that would be important to this partnership, and that feminists have also left out Black feminist, African feminist, feminists from the continent and from the diaspora, and that we wanted to position the two and bring the two together, to be both Pan-African and feminist, and to learn from both and to harmonize both and bring both together. And then when we started thinking about what is the key way to do this, and what do we need to actually expand and build on a community, an analysis of Pan-African and feminist philanthropies, we came out of that with 3 pillars. The first is around narrative and principles. The second is around advocacy and influencing. And the third is about infrastructure and funding. And the 3 come together to uphold this vision, right, of Pan-African and feminist philanthropies. And the belief was that we have to start with narratives and principles. So it's at the core of what we believe. It's the core of what we do, and how you think about money, and how you think about resources, and how you think about who owns them, who makes decisions around them, who manages them, and this idea that resources come from our communities, and that a lot of philanthropic institutions have also built their resources in extractive ways, extracted from the continent, extracted from global South and global majority communities. So we really wanted to focus on the narratives and ideology piece. So what do we think deep in our hearts and souls, and what are the narratives and language we use to describe philanthropies, to describe giving, to describe why money and resources and moving capital matters. So really starting at the heart of narratives and principles. Then looking at advocacy and influencing. So who do we need to advocate with? Who do we need to influence? How do we work with different philanthropic institutions to do more of the advocacy and influencing work? And then third was around just creating our own infrastructures and endowments so that we have our own resources to work with, and so that those resources would then be invested in ways that are community serving and community led. So those are the 3 pillars.
Yeah. I'm aware that over the last couple of years, there's obviously been some movement to a point where I know there's been some fundraising that has been taking place. I think recently the team was traveling across Europe, not Europe, US, but also in Africa. There was a launch in Addis. So how far have we come with those 3 pillars? I know I'm also part of the 3rd pillar.
You are.
So we can talk about my own work on the 3rd pillar. But how far have we come with this grand idea, which I think for the most part was really something that was needed in the continent, given the nature of funding, especially to movements. I think that the conversations so far that have taken place, whether it's the Barazas by Trust Africa and others, they've really shown that social movements in their variety have really been starved of funding in one form or the other. And to speak of feminist and women's movements, I think it even shows the cracks that are actually there in the architecture of funding. But these last 2 or so years, how far have we come towards realizing some of the objectives?
So I think just beginning with February 23, when there was this second Indaba, that was much broader and then centered around our pillars. And as you'll remember, in the closing of that Indaba, we launched the pillars and we launched the endowment. And Edmund from Urgent Action Fund Africa stood up and said, I will contribute $50 a month from my paycheck. And you were there in the room. And so everybody then started contributing time, talent, and treasure. And it wasn't just treasure, even though $520,000 were raised at that event with contributions of $200,000 from Trust Africa and Urgent Action Fund Africa each. But that was something that was incredible, just to see the ownership, the contributions, the commitments of people in the room, people on WhatsApp calls, people were calling their aunties and sisters. And so that was incredible. And then people also contributed across time and talent, and you contributed CAFC's work, and I think you knew at the time that the Women in African Philanthropies initiative would be coming up. And so I think it's really looking, Becky, at there's a whole infrastructure and ecosystem across the continent of people doing different things to influence philanthropy, and how do we build on that. Coming out of that meeting was a working group that created the narratives and principles. And so there was a group of people with Halima and myself and Ashley and Rose and Jackie and others who were all present, that we developed the narratives and principles and had a whole consultative process around that. So we have the narratives and principles, and we'll be developing some tools around how to map and see where narratives are changing, where practices are changing. Are they narratives coming from the continent or not? So there's some plans to do more of that this year. Around the advocacy and influencing, as you mentioned, there was this whole roadshow that went to the US, and I'll talk about that in a minute, as well as work across the continent just to raise awareness of what's happening around the narratives and principles, what this initiative is about. We've had different sessions with Adɔyɛ, with Jazz, with AWDF, at the African Philanthropy Conference, at the African Philanthropy Forum, and then at AWID. So really starting with the continent and the launch, as you mentioned, at the AU and ADIS, and then looking also globally. And then there is the endowment, and we'll come to that in a minute, because you have played such an important role in that. But what we did at the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women last year, since it was on financing and money flows, many of us were going to New York to discuss some of this at the Commission on the Status of Women. And what's interesting is that event, if you were in New York, it basically takes place, at the UN, a few blocks from the UN. We just used the fact that we were there to meet with a wide range of African, Pan-African, African-American institutions, movements, and funds. So we met, for example, with Movements for Black Lives. We had iftar with them because it was during Ramadan, actually, the last CSW. We went to a community fund that's working with immigrant groups in Harlem. And it was interesting because the UN was having all these meetings and discussions on financing, and we saw how unrelated and uninvolved communities that are very close to the UN in New York actually were. And I think it's something that we always need to remember, because these conversations, we need to make sure that they're grounded in the realities of the communities we serve and the communities we work with. But that was really rich. We met with activists, we met with funds, we spoke about this initiative, we met with Pan-African and African philanthropists, we met with groups that started Black Philanthropy Month in the US. So that was a really rich experience because we believe that this work really needs to be Pan-African and to work with diaspora communities because, as you know, they give so much. There's so much giving through remittances and other forms of giving. And I think that's an untapped resource that we want to do more with. So that took place last year. This year, the goal is to do something similar in Europe. And then there's the endowment. And so you have been very involved in the scoping study. I mean, you led the scoping study. But really looking at what it means, Becky, to set up an endowment that is autonomous, that is independent, that can move money across the continent in flexible, easy ways. It's challenging, and you can say more about that because you led the scoping study.
So firstly, before I get to what came out of it, I remember very vividly when we were in Dakar and even before then that there was clarity that you wanted an endowment, not a fund. Maybe we talk about that because in the beginning, a lot of people would not have made the distinction between a fund and endowment. And as you saw in the report, there are some actually who still argue that for you to get to an endowment in an African setting, you probably want to start with a fund. But I know there were specific contextual and maybe other factors that you considered as to why you wanted an endowment and not a fund.
So one issue that we were very clear around was that we did not want to replace or compete with existing funds. And there are existing funds on the continent, and we had done a mapping of feminist funds and community funds and West African funds, East African funds. So I think on one hand, the idea was never to compete with funds, but to have more of an endowment that would be start doing some immediate grant making, but have longer term investments that could be used for structural investments. So investing in ecosystems, investing in community banks, investing in infrastructure for the philanthropic and Pan-African and feminist philanthropic and movements across the continent. So I think the idea of endowment was that it would be invested in ways that serve the continent and thinking about how to do that, as well as not replacing existing funds. I also think we were really looking to you, quite frankly, and the scoping study to help us understand the difference between the two, how you invest money in ways that are aligned with your values and your politics, and how we were serving in an additional way and not replacing or competing with additional funds. So that's some of the rationale that came from behind.
So I think at the end, it actually came out very well in the sense that even though there are tensions between a fund and an endowment in terms of the journey towards that, I think overall there's overwhelming interest in an endowment. So even if it takes several years to build it, the idea is we should build an endowment. So that's the first. The second is that there's also overwhelming interest in how to build that endowment in ways that are contextually relevant to the movements themselves in Africa. And so taking into account the now and the future, taking into account issues of diversity, inclusion, participation, representation, etc., etc. So those are the things that you would see in terms of how the endowment needs to be structured and governed, but also in terms of jurisdiction, where should it be located. Obviously, in the beginning, I think in terms of ideological underpinnings, people would want it to be located in Africa. But when you really get into the practicalities of it, you then think about what happens if endowments are not performing in Africa. What do you do? We have examples of endowments that were created in Africa and they have not grown. And so do we get stuck with the geographic location, or we actually look at the purpose of the endowment? So I think those are some of the considerations that at some point the institutions and the movements will have to get down and really begin now the actual work of building the endowment. But I think the the process has already started. There's interest in it, and I think, like you said, if we build on what already exists, because some of the funds are very clear that they are behind this process,
Yes.
but they also don't want it to be taken away from what they are already doing. And so how do we build around what they are already doing, whether it's the charters that exist, the infrastructure that exists, etc., etc. So I think it's a very interesting journey that we are likely to see going forward, which then takes me to the question, what next for Ubuntu Harambee, and why was there a need to change the name?
Yes. So it's Harambee Ubuntu.
Ubuntu, yeah.
And the idea was that we've always thought of ourselves as Pan-African and feminists, and needing to ground our work in approaches to giving and African ways of describing the ways we give. And Adɔyɛ has done that in a beautiful way, love in action, so that we're not just philanthropists resonate with the communities we work at, and it means different. So Harambee Ubuntu is very much that we are about community. We are about I am because you are because we are. It was about recognizing what it means to give and to be in community, and to be that our futures and our lives are interconnected and our destinies are interconnected. So it felt that we were capturing that, that we didn't have when we were discussing just Pan-African and feminist philanthropies. We also want to be in global spaces where we're using African words to describe what we do, because that's where we come from.
Yeah.
So that's why the language was changed, and that was done at a strategizing meeting last year. And then what's up for this year is a real focus on diving much deeper into the narratives and principles and tool development work around that. A roadshow that we're hoping to do, increasingly, of course, on the continent where we're based, hopefully at APC. There'll be opportunities, Becky, to really meet with some of the North Africans that have been part of our work. And it was great to see like Leila at the last APC meeting. But that will be an opportunity to meet with other funds and institutions, and Ali's institution at the John Gerhardt.
That's why the Sawiris Foundation is part of the organizing team now.
Okay, great.
So it would be good to arrange maybe a pre-meetings with them as well.
Yes. So I think there's opportunities there. And then going much deeper with like the next steps around the endowment and the scoping study. We want to continue to raise funds, of course, and it's a very challenging funding climate right now, but we're, and then of course, continuing the constituency building, because it really is about how Harambee Ubuntu serves and is aligned with the existing philanthropic movement on the continent, because there's so much that's been achieved in the last few years, and so much seeds that have been planted, seeds that are going, and so much more that we could do collectively.
And I'm also looking forward to see how, and I'm glad you raised this point, that at the second meeting in Naivasha, when everyone was pledging, I didn't have money, but I pledged that CAPSI was going to run.
Of course.
Going to run with an initiative that would focus on this. And that initiative is Adɔyɛ. And I'm glad that you've been working with the team, with Tandy and Halima, to really, kind of build it. And we've tried as CAPSI to say, even though CAPSI is the host of this initiative, its beginnings are tied to several things. One is Tandy herself, who was doing a master's, and then she had an interest in a program on women. And we said to her, try thinking about how to develop it, and she had an opportunity to go to Kuni to work with other fellows there to think about that. But at the same time, when this meeting happened, there was obviously a lacuna which we saw, and we said, as CAPSI, we could do this, and so would have a program that could develop modules on philanthropy, women, feminism. We could also do research, we could also do advocacy, etc., etc. And so over the last, I would say 2 or so years, you have been working with the steering committee to shape and develop Adɔyɛ. Maybe let's talk a bit about that, because you are one of the people that has been heavily involved. How important is this component of the work, especially around research, teaching, but also other forms of advocacy that are specific to women in philanthropy? And how do you see that advancing the work of Harambee Ubuntu?
Yeah. So I think Harambee Ubuntu and Adɔyɛ are both initiatives whose times have really come, and they're surfacing at a moment that's so critical in our understanding of philanthropy on the continent and with the diaspora. And for me, Adɔyɛ, love in action and looking at African women's role in philanthropy is looking at all the stories that we know about, all the research that we know about, or research that we haven't yet done, but that show how women give and what it means for women to give in communities. And we know from what research that Theo has done, that Rose has done at Epic Africa, that Kumba's doing with Invisible Giants, that women give in all kinds of ways in their communities. They give around crisis situations. They were key around HIV and AIDS, around Ebola, around COVID. They're key in crisis situations, but they're just key in the well-being and community health and community well-being of their communities. And so I think looking at the way women give, both in terms of the mechanisms and modalities, is it savings groups, is it savings clubs, is it community organizations, is it community foundations? What are horizontal philanthropies? What is the language that's being used? What are the mechanisms that they have to move money, to pool money, to allocate money? Some of what Halima has done in her report with Trust Africa and Giving Tuesdays Africa point to the language that people use. So I think that's really important. I think we need more research. And that's where Adɔyɛ is coming in. What is the research questions? What are the research questions? And we've developed some of those in the concept paper. What do we know? What do we not know? What do we need to know more to advance our agenda? That's really important. I think it's so great to have students to be at a university setting, to be able to think about curriculum, to be able to think about programs, to be able to think about fellowships that can support this work moving forward. And so to me, that's what's so exciting about being at CAPSI and being at a university where there's all of those opportunities to move our agenda forward.
Yeah. I know, Leila, that we are really scratching the surface because there's a lot that we could dig into. But I'm also excited because you are here at a writing retreat. And the assumption is that, we are just giving people teasers to what is yet to come. Maybe let's end the conversation for part one by talking a bit about what your experience has been starting the year at a writing retreat deep in the bushes of Mpumalanga in South Africa.
Well, this is the greatest gift. And something else I think that CAPSI offers is a place like this to meet. That Wits University has this place in CAPSI, and that's wonderful just to have a retreat center that's safe, where there's a beautiful outdoors, where there's a pool, where we're well fed, that we can just come together. I've never actually done anything like this, and so being with feminists from the continent, being in a space where there's sisterhood and there's a sense of belonging, making all these connections. So already we're talking to people about all kinds of research ideas, about all kinds of ways we can collaborate. Being with individuals like Kumba and BC, whose stories we need to keep documenting. BC's story of founding AWDF, these stories we don't always know. And so even coming into a space like this, knowing the stories of everybody in the room, and recognizing the wealth of knowledge in the room is so important, because I think we need to also document our own stories and connections. I think this will influence, Tandy and I have already been thinking of, and there's Jackie, and then Bongi was here, but she had to leave. So already thinking about some of the research questions that we're thinking about here. that Adɔyɛ could be moving forward. It's also great to be with creatives. So there's poets, there's fiction and nonfiction writing and creative nonfiction writing. So I've written a lot, as you know, I've written a lot of fiction, and so I'm thinking, but how do I write more creative nonfiction and how we think about art in our work and fiction in our work and writing in our work is something that has come out of this that I think is really important.
Yeah. So talking about, creatives, I want to end by acknowledging some of the work that was done this morning by some creatives from the women's space. So the cloth that you see here is a gift from Nyawal to Maseko. And Maseko is a designer herself. She runs a clothing line, Bola Nangabe, and she says that her first outfit was actually made from this cloth.
That's beautiful.
And then, of course, what you see here is Nyawal and Tandi who managed to design this for us. And of course, Matt is our creative behind the camera. So I just wanted to make sure that we credit some of the outcomes that are coming out of here. They are not documented, so we are using this opportunity to document some of that.
But the importance of beauty and aesthetics and African designs and African designers is so important to the work that we do. So I really appreciated when I walked in, I thought, this space is so beautiful. Who made it so beautiful? And these are flowers that were cut and plants from our walks right down the road. So thank you, Becky, for inviting me to this conversation.
Thank you, Leila. I know we still have more to cover, and I'm hoping that the product of your writing would also add to the conversation. And maybe in a couple of years, we might actually revisit to do another part. I'm actually excited to meet again with Janet and Jackie because we did episodes before with them, and we are now, updating those episodes. So there's always an opportunity for us to update, especially areas where we did not cover. I know we left out a lot. One of the areas I would have really wanted to touch on, but we are going to touch on maybe next time, is the importance of the Global Fund for Women in terms of seeding many initiatives, some of which have actually spun out to stand alone. For example, the Black Feminist Fund and many others. And you were actually at the thick and thin of those things. So when we do meet again, I would want us to talk about that. But I'm also hoping that in your writing, that's something that you are also paying attention to.
I am. I am, and I'd love to speak more about the role of the Global Fund for Women and other funds in seeding, strengthening, linking feminist funds. I mean, the whole idea of feminist funds that started in the 80s has now become very widespread with national funds and regional funds and global majority funds. But it really came out of funds that were set up because traditional philanthropy, in that case it was Hewlett, which is where one of the funders came from, could not move money in ways that really mattered to feminist movements and allowed feminist movements to do their work. And so feminist funds said, we're going to set up our own institutions. And I think that learning is important. We need insider-outsider strategies. Sometimes it's working to influence philanthropic institutions, but also when they're not moving fast enough or deeply enough to meet our needs, we set up our own. And that's been a strategy, as you know.
So Leila, until the next time we meet again, thank you so much for
Thank you, Becky.
Us.
Thank you. We so appreciate Adɔyɛ and CAPSI and our collaboration. So thank you.
Thank you. So that was Leila Hessini joining us here at the sidelines of the writing retreat that is dedicated to women from across the continent, but also from across other experiences as well, including the Caribbean as well. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.